Hello, everyone. I'm Aldo Flores-Quiroga, visiting professor at the LBJ School of the University of Texas at Austin. I teach energy policy, and I am very happy to welcome a true expert, a world expert on oil, gas, and in general energy markets, Mr. Bob McNally, who is not only a person of reference, a very important commentator on these matters, but has written an amazing book that I suggest everyone reads. It's called Crude Volatility, the History and the Future of Boom-Bust Oil Prices. Bob is also an entrepreneur and a musician, so he's a creative individual, and I'm very happy to have him with us in this conversation. Bob, I wanted to bring you into the arena in these conversations at the LBJ School so that we can talk about what's going on with the oil market. There's a lot of interest and concern on the behavior and of oil prices. It seems that we are now in a very dire situation. How do you see this going on?
Thank you, Aldo. And let me start by saying that's high praise coming from you. I know of your musicianship and your energy leadership, both in Mexico and at the IEF. So to receive such high praise from someone like you is really an honor for me. And I'm delighted to be here and to be part of this series. You know, the over 60% collapse in crude oil prices over the last 30 days is sort of the biggest, but the third spectacular volatile move in oil prices we've seen over the last 15 years or so. And it's another indication, a reminder of something that we haven't really experienced since the early 1930s, which is how the oil market behaves when there's no swing producer, when there's no OPEC or the predecessor of OPEC, as you know very well, and you're sitting in the state and the city where swing production began in Austin, Texas in 1932. Texas inaugurated 4 decades of aggressive control of oil supply to prevent the type of volatility that we're seeing in oil prices, today. So in short, the volatile prices, in this case a collapse, that is doing so much damage to the state of Texas and the oil industry, is due in part to the lack of a swing producer. Russia and Saudi Arabia had been playing that role in the last few years, but they, if not getting a divorce, they're living separately. They broke up. They are not cooperating. In fact, Saudi Arabia and Russia are trying to put every barrel into the market they can. You know, the real reason, though, that we find ourselves here is this coronavirus and the amazing and just unbelievable collapse in demand for oil as we shut down much of Europe and the United States and come out of a shutdown in China. Some 20% of global demand is going to be crushed in the month of April. And I know you as a student, observer, policymaker in the global oil markets, will share with me the sense that this is really astounding. And it's really a problem that even if we had an OPEC, or even if we had a Texas Railroad Commission, even if we had an effective swing producer, this problem, this sudden collapse in demand for jet fuel and gasoline and diesel would be a problem even those former swing producers would struggle to manage. So that's really what we're seeing. If you will, 2 black swans have appeared suddenly. One is the coronavirus and the unprecedented near-term collapse in oil demand. And secondly, the breakup of this swing producer group, Saudi Arabia and Russia, called OPEC Plus. And the two things have colluded, if you will, or combined to send oil prices now down to $20 a barrel. We'll see at the time folks are seeing this, if it hasn't gone lower, I suspect it will, and causing still unfolding dramatic damage to investment in oil producing states like Texas.
Bob, so now that you mentioned these 2 factors, the demand side, the impact of the coronavirus on the consumption of fuels, and what's going on the supply and the lack of an agreement among Saudi, OPEC and non-OPEC members, but mainly Saudi and Russia. Let's stick with the second part. I think that the demand side is very much contingent on what happens with the world economy and the process of relief from this pandemic. Why is it so difficult for these countries to reach an agreement? What do you see as a challenge? It seems that this is an ongoing thing behind the volatility of markets.
Right. Well, it's the size of the problem. It's the size of the problem. You know, the OPEC Plus, this swing producer group that had been playing the role until recently, composed of Russia and Saudi Arabia at the lead. Really, Russia was not a very enthusiastic member. Russia's not used to voluntarily cutting its own production to keep oil prices stable, which is what Texas used to do and Saudi Arabia has done. It's what a swing producer must do when there's oversupply. So Russia was sort of a grudging, reluctant member. And Russia's view was, look, okay, we don't want to see $26 a barrel that collapsed in 2016, just 4 years ago. We don't want to see that again. So we're willing to help out a little bit. Saudi Arabia has been cutting, Russia has been cutting 200,000-300,000 barrels a day out of 11 plus million barrels a day. So Russia, until it met the coronavirus, Russia was willing to contribute a little bit toward collective supply management. And Saudi Arabia was contributing much more. For every barrel that for every barrel that Russia cut, Saudi Arabia cut 7 or 8 barrels. So that was going well enough until we met the mother of all demand collapses because of the coronavirus. And now, instead of cutting a few 100,000 barrels a day, Russia would be asked to cut 1 million barrels a day, or even maybe a little less, but still high, 700,000-800,000 barrels a day. This is a big problem. Aldo, you remember we've had big demand collapses before in the late 1990s due to the Asian financial crisis, and then in 2008 rather, in 2009. Back then, you needed 4+ million barrels a day of OPEC cuts, usually over several rounds of cutting, over a year or two. And that was what we're getting into here. Russia saw that coming and said, no way. We did not sign up for big cuts like that. And then Saudi Arabia said, well, if you won't cut, we won't cut. And if none of us are going to cut, we're all going to produce all we can. And that has led to the tidal wave of oil and the collapse of oil prices. One historical note that you'll remember from the book, and again, it's a indication of how seriously Texas, when it used to be OPEC, played the role. Back in the 1950s, demand for oil and gasoline hadn't really taken off yet. That was a story for the 1960s. I think every rock and roll song in the 1960s was about driving a car, being in a car, baby drive my car, car. But in the 50s, we hadn't really started the driving era yet. So demand was still moderate. We were recovering from World War II and so forth. But we discovered a lot of new oil supply, especially in the Middle East. And Texas had a problem similar to the problem that we have today. And not as sudden and not due to a virus, but the same problem. Not enough demand and too much supply. What did Texas do? Texas regulators sitting in Austin ordered Texas oil producers to cut production massively in the state. Texas and other oil states held 20% of world oil production off the market due to regulations. And the Seven Sisters, which were operating the Middle East fields, then contributed another 15%. So in the 1950s, to keep oil stable, you had the swing producer, Texas, the Seven Sisters, holding 1/3 of all the production capacity in the world off the market. That is an astounding level of discipline and determination. Now, why did Texas do that? I've always admired Texans in Texas. You know, I worked for President George W. Bush on his National Economic Council and National Security Council. I admire Texans for 2 things. One, they keep government limited. I'm a kind of a small government kind of guy. And number 2, they're really good at finding oil and gas, and that's been a good thing. But imagine it was these Texans who resorted to such heavy regulation over oil supply to keep prices stable, because they remembered in the 1920s and the 1930s how wildly volatile oil prices behave when there is no supply regulator. So in a way, swing production is sort of a necessary, not let's say evil, but a necessary regulator to keep oil prices stable.
Now, it seems that today we need something similar, right? You said demand is falling 20%, that's 20 million barrels. The Seven Sisters and the Texas regulators were able to bring production down 30%. So it's something like that is needed, but we don't seem to have the same instruments available with the difficulties inside OPEC, between OPEC and Russia. People are now talking about maybe Texas stepping in again, relying on quotas. A US or two of American companies working in Texas have asked for the same thing. How do you see that as a possibility? How does governance play a role now in the oil market?
Yeah.
How should it be?
It's more challenging now, Aldo. Back in the 1940s and the 1950s, the United States, along with the oil fields in the Middle East, controlled by Anglo-American and French oil companies. So let's call it the West. The West dominated not only production, but exports of oil. And Texas was so large that Texas alone could be a price setter. It had pricing power due to the size of its production and exports. But those days are long gone. Texas is too small. Texas is now considering going back to quotas, and that motion was made by some producers, not because Texas can set the price like it used to, but in the hope that if Texas puts in place somewhat symbolic quotas, maybe that would urge or impel Saudi Arabia, Russia, the other bigger producers to go back to playing the role. So you'd have more of coordinated cuts from different countries. But even Saudi Arabia now is not big enough in the oil market as Texas was back in the day, and currently is not big enough to do this all by itself. It just doesn't have the power alone that the Texans did. And so Saudi Arabia has insisted, understandably, that other big producers cooperate with it and contribute cuts. And you've just had a breakdown of that cooperation, especially between Russia and Saudi Arabia. Since the 1980s, Saudi doctrine has been, we will not cut alone, right? They did that in the early 1980s. And after 1985 and 86, they said never again. And then in 2014, then oil minister Naimi promulgated what we might call the Naimi corollary to the Saudi doctrine, which is Saudi Arabia will not cut without Russia. Period, end of story. And so again, if Mr. Putin is not willing to at least make small contributions to broader cuts, Saudi Arabia will walk away. And that's what we have today.
So we may have a new corollary that neither of them will cut without Texas or something like that?
Well, I think Russia certainly would like to see U.S. production go down. That's for sure. I think the Saudis less so. I think it's a myth that Saudi Arabia sees shale as the enemy. I don't think so. Saudi Arabia and the shale producers produce different types of oil. They sell it to different places. And the Saudis see long-term that we're going to need more oil supply. They can't balance the market all by themselves. And shale oil offers plentiful, but also relatively flexible oil supply. So I don't think the Saudis are out to kill shale. The Russians are. Now, the fact of the matter is, though, with this demand decline, it's so big, it's snowballing so fast that we're unavoidably going to see production decline outside of Saudi Arabia and Russia. You're seeing it in Canada already. So producers that have relatively high operating costs, Canadian oil sands, North Sea, some North Sea production. Venezuela has some high cost production, and shale oil. Shale oil, the break evens for new completions and so forth is, the best operators, it's the high 20s. So here at $20 a barrel, you're seeing involuntary shutdowns of oil production outside of OPEC. And I think the Saudis and the Russians effectively are letting that happen, and they're going to let that happen more at some point, probably later this year, after a lot of damage has been done, perhaps after the virus effect has started to fade. They may step back in and help with the, let's say, cleanup. But this will only be after a lot more damage has been done, unfortunately.
So, but basically, what this means is that markets are doing their job. The price signal will work and bring down some production, excess production. But at the same time, without some type of governance or of help from these type of arrangements, markets might go to extremes. And that's part of your message, that this is a market, the oil market, prone to booms and busts, and we need some sort of a regulator.
Right.
And now the difficulty of having a regulator is that no one is big enough to lead the other ones into an agreement so that prices can be stabilized.
Right. I think that's essentially it. We're rediscovering, by the experience of tremendous oil price volatility and the macroeconomic damage that does, why 90 years ago, Texans sitting in Austin decided to inaugurate some of the most aggressive, heavy-handed government control, not only of oil, but perhaps any economic activity of which I'm unaware. It wasn't because they liked the idea of government giving orders to drillers, or they liked the idea of surrendering market share by holding back their own production so that other producers who don't respect the limits are increasing. Texans don't like that. I don't like that. Most people don't like that. But they did it out of an imperative to keep the price of oil, which after all was and is the lifeblood of modern civilization, stable. And it's that stability imperative which is driving us towards the need for a supply regulator. And the question, I think, for the future is, will we even have one? I think it's one of the most important questions for macroeconomic stability and even geopolitical stability going forward.
And well, that's a huge question that I'm sure you're already working on, and that gives us a lot of food for thought at the LBJ School. I am teaching energy policy. I'm asking the students to think about these issues. They are reading your book, and we are analyzing exactly what can be done to improve the working of this whole market. So I want to thank you very much for your time, for this reference, very useful. And I do look forward to continue benefiting from your insights about the oil industry. And hopefully we get to, as we have said before, play music together as well, just like this conversation that we're having.
Thank you, Aldo. I look forward to it. I think it's a spectacular time for young folks, especially, to be entering energy and environment, and all that is very interesting, exciting, a bit terrifying, but tremendously interesting. And I'm sure your students are benefiting, again, from your tremendous experience and leadership. And I look forward to seeing you and maybe jamming together in Austin or Washington. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and we'll keep in touch. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.